This recording is a test. This recording is a test. So, the earlier recording today, we broached the topic of free will. We broached the sort of we framed the issue in terms of some historical exegesis, starting with how the problem of free will figured in the Middle Ages, and it figured at the confluence of two sort of sources of knowledge, or domains of knowledge, one source being rationality, reason, and science, and the other source being revelation or religious dogma. Usually revelation is one of the core sources. And so we framed that problem as a problem of reconciling conception of God and within religious dogma, and how that conception of God as omnipotent and all-knowing and all-present, omniscient, squares with human freedom, and whether human freedom is possible in that worldview. And we considered, for example, Boethius's solution to it, namely that God is outside of time and space, and therefore the notion of God influencing or predetermining events is not in conflict with us freely choosing events. Now, whether that is a satisfactory solution, you can consider for yourself. But the idea is that there was an attempt to reconcile these pictures, picture of predetermination and the picture of human freedom. We also consider the definitions of freedom and will. Will basically being this executive faculty, cognitive faculty that allows us to choose courses of action, one course of action over another. And freedom, we distinguish between political freedom and freedom of will. Political freedom being the more sort of political conception of the concept of freedom, which has to do with coercive social structures like states and institutions, and being sort of free of coercive institutions, which is agnostic about whether there is freedom of will or not. So the freedom of will is a different issue. Now, you could argue, you could make the claim that freedom of that political freedom is presupposes freedom of will. You could make that argument, or you could not make that argument. That could go either way. But it was important to distinguish between political freedom and freedom of the will. And freedom of the will is what we're trying to, the issue that we're trying to raise, and then potentially look for resolutions. Okay, so I spoke about the kind of historical background that was the sort of the historical background in the Middle Ages, and that's going somewhat far back in time, and then how that then shifted, the worldview shifted with the onset of the scientific revolution, with new modes of economic activity, with conceptions of individuals as free, and social contract theory seeping into political thought, etc., etc. You have the scientific revolution, and you have a more naturalistic picture of nature emerge. And this naturalistic picture of nature, God figures less and less. It's less about intelligent design, and it's more about can we formalize the rules by which nature obeys. And we paradigmatic example of this are Newton's is Newtonian mechanics, where you have 3 laws of motion. You have the law of gravitation, inverse proportionality, inverse square law of how gravitation works, all that. And we notice that there is a picture of nature as potentially clockwork, as mechanistic. And so in this mechanistic picture, we considered the idea of cause and effect, and the principle of sufficient cause. And the principle of sufficient cause says that effects are preceded by sufficient causes. And if the cause is sufficient, the effect must be necessary. Sufficient causes produce necessary effects. They necessitate their effects. And this sort of like cause-effect schema kind of like locks us in a deterministic picture where room for, so to speak, alternative choices seems to be blocked off. And what this deterministic picture, we give a formal definition of determinism, and a formal definition of determinism is essentially, I can put it in a bit less formal sense right now, is that all the events up until arbitrary point in time, in conjunction with the laws of physics or the laws of nature, entail one and only one possible future. So this entailment relation, right, it's a deductive relation, basically says that if you have all the information, you can really deduce the future. If you could induce the future, well, really there's no freedom there. The future is entailed in the past. The past has already tells us exactly how the future is going to unfold. And one way that I cash this out is by quoting Laplace. And Laplace has this thought experiment, Laplace's demon, where he says that if we have sufficient information about the initial conditions, then we can deduce to the minutest details how physical reality will unfold. And we're presuming here that physical reality is, let's say, all that there is, although there was a diversity of viewpoints, obviously, at that time, but there's this picture of nature as potentially as clockwork that seems to contravene the idea that we can choose amongst alternatives. And it would seem as though the idea of free will presupposes that there are at least events, or some subset of events, that are not predetermined, whose outcome is not entailed by the past, but rather that the past does not necessitate all types of events, and there is a subset of events where the human being factors causally in the outcomes. Exactly what that means is controversial and requires a lot of working through complex details. So one of the things that I didn't bring up is quantum mechanics and how quantum mechanics foils the Laplacian picture, the Newtonian-Laplacian picture, whereby we're presupposing that with sufficient information we can deduce the future given the laws of nature. Well, at the quantum scale, we know that we can't do that. We know that we have a formalism that essentially says that the probabilities are intrinsic to nature rather than being absence of information. So in the Laplacian picture, probabilities deduced to or reduced to absence of information, whereas in the quantum picture, probabilities are intrinsic. Now, exactly what probabilities being intrinsic means is controversial and a matter of interpretation both of the mathematical formalism and the theory of the theory of quantum mechanics. So there are canonical interpretations, but there isn't one interpretation that reigns over all of them. We will delve into that a little bit later. The other thing that I brought up is how Kant frames the topic of the conflict, the apparent conflict between freedom of will and determinism. And we saw that in the Kantian picture, there's a dual aspect, either dual aspect or dual world. There's debate about that. Either dual aspect or dual world picture of the world, picture of reality, and one aspect is the phenomenal realm and the other is the noumenal realm. We saw that the phenomenal realm is the world or reality as we experience it, and Kant posits that the reality as we experience it is structured by certain a priori structures, certain innate formal structures through which all experience is filtered. So the mind is not a passive receptacle of data. It's not kind of a Lockean, Humean sense, just a container where information comes from the empirical world and is just filled with information, but rather the mind plays a constructive role in constituting reality as we experience it. And we saw that Kant thinks that there are two pure forms of intuition, space and time, which structure all of experience spatio-temporally. So it's not that space and time are features of the world as such, of the things in themselves, as he says, or rather the noumenal realm, but they're features that the mind brings to bear in structuring experience. So experience is spatio-temporally ordered because the mind has these two forms of pure intuition. The mind further has innate categories and essentially synthesizes raw sensory input into the objects that we experience. So the objects that you experience are essentially, at least in part, mentally constituted. They are synthesized. And they're synthesized both by pure forms of intuition and the categories essentially, and that there's some connection between, there's a schematism between pure a priori categories and the sort of like the manifold, the sensory manifold filtered through the pure intuitions of space and time. Sorry, I got into too much details there, but essentially Kant says that the phenomenal realm is what we experienced, and the phenomenal realm is where he places the Newtonian and Laplacian picture of the world. That picture of causes necessitating effects, that apodicity, Kant uses the term apodicity. Apodicity just means it's necessary. So the rules by which our experience is structured are necessary because they are a priori contained in the subject, in the human agent, in the mind that constructs the world. And so the reason why we can discover laws of nature, and why the laws of nature are exceptionless regularities, is because the schematology is innate in the human being. It's innate in the mind. So there is the phenomenal realm. So the phenomenal realm, that's where determinism is true. And so the human being experiences itself as not free. It experiences itself as part of the phenomenal realm, and therefore determined by prior causes, where there is no room for free will. And on the other hand, Kant says he leaves the logical possibility that in the noumenal realm, this is the realm that's epistemologically close to us, in the realm that we have no epistemological access to, we have no knowledge of, just because our knowledge necessarily is the filtering of empirical information through innate structures. The noumenal realm, we are potentially free. And the way that he cashes this out is that the human being is autonomous when it obeys the laws of reason. And of course, Kant has a dual conception of reason. There is theoretical reason or pure reason. This is the aspect of reason that allows us to determine things as true or false. Right? It's elethic. That's the term that's used. Elethic comes from the Greek aletheia, meaning truth. And then the other part is practical. It has to do with pursuing ends through means. Reason is also instrumental, and that's called instrumental reason or practical reason. And all of elethic reason is in some respects subordinated to instrumental reason, because human beings are instrumental creatures, right? We are acting out in the world, we are moving towards certain goods, etc., etc., and truth could be one of the goods that we move towards. Now, Kant says that the human being is paradigmatically free if and only if it follows reason in its practical concerns. Now, what exactly that means? It follows universal maxims, and he calls universal maxims categorical imperatives. Imperatives that are categorically, they hold categorically, and categorically mean at all times. There are no exceptions. They are similar to the exceptionalist regularities of Newtonian mechanics, the exceptional regularities of the laws of logic, like the law of non-contradiction, etc., but in the realm of prescription, in the realm of actions, in the realm of morality and practical reason. And so essentially he ends up saying that when we follow, so what we have to bear in mind is that reason doesn't work in a way in which anything goes, but rather it corners us to accept certain maxims, and it corners us to accept maxims that can be willed universally. And he thinks that the maxims that can be willed universally, well, these are called categorical imperatives. An example would be things like "thou shalt not kill," "thou shalt not lie," etc., which coincide with certain elements of Christian morality. But essentially, the reason what makes "thou shalt not kill" or "thou shalt not lie" a maxim that can be willed universally is because if everybody were to follow that maxim then things would work out. Everybody's plans would harmonize. I'm putting this very, very colloquially. But it would not entail some sort of instrumental or moral contradiction for the maxim to be willed universally, which implies that if everybody follows it, it would create a net outcome of harmony, a net outcome of moral rectitude. And so if you have the opposite, the converse, like thou shalt kill or thou shalt lie, etc., etc., well, if I lie and you lie, then things would not work out. This is called, in the literature, to use a term of art, deontic constraint. It's a constraint that holds inconsequentially. Either way, essentially, what I'm saying is that Kant, is essentially saying that when the human being his actions are determined by pure reason, namely when it follows the categorical imperative, then the will, that faculty that acts out, is autonomous or free. However, the human being does not experience itself as autonomous. It experiences itself in the phenomenal realm. That's the realm that we have epistemological access to. And so we experience ourselves as determined by prior causes and as our actions necessitated by effects. So this schema applies to all of our experience, but he leaves out the logical possibility. That the will is free when it is determined by pure reason alone. And then I delved into why Kant's sort of nominal phenomenal schema is not quite consistent or coherent picture with our current more beliefs about the world. So, for example, I don't believe that causes and effects are posited, are in the mind, or that space and time are things in the mind. I think that they are features of the external world, and Kant resolves the Humean skepticism, or this is skepticism that's sort of raised by the philosopher David Hume, right? Which he says is we don't really have knowledge of causes, and Kant wants to say, well, he resolves that skepticism by saying we do have knowledge of causes, we have knowledge of laws of nature, but this knowledge really comes from us. We are the ones who structure experience through universal laws, and that's why we can discover universal laws, because we impose them upon the world. And this is not the kind of paradigmatic view of most scientists and philosophers. It's not my view. For example, I don't think that Kant's transcendental idealism is entirely coherent, even though that's extremely debatable, and Kant's transcendental idealism, as laid out in the Critique of Pure Reason, is an incredible it's an incredible theory taken as a whole, with lots of amazing and interesting and perceptive claims, and but essentially what we believe today is that causes and effects are in the world. I believe that the world impinges upon my senses, and then the information is processed through various hierarchical layers until I represent it in some way and I speak about it. Okay, so but the reason why Kant comes up is because there is a way to vindicate the vein in which Kant's claims are made, the sense in which reason seems to dislodge us from the causal nexus. So Kant says that the will is heteronymous or unfree when it obeys inclinations. So, for example, if I get hungry and I go to eat, if I have an inclination for sex, or if I get angry and I'm out of control, all of these things are really just determined, right? They're bodily functions, etc., etc. I'm not really free. I'm just following inclinations. But Kant says you're really free when when the will is really determined by pure reason, and pure reason corners you to accept certain universal maxims, and when you act in accordance with those maxims, well, you're not really following inclination. Those actions seem to be determined by something other than prior causes. The will is really causing itself. Well, he says it's uncaused, it's autonomous. This is not what we believe today, but if you look at the evidence, the vein in which Kant's claims are made there is a great element of truth to that. And an element of truth is that, for example, a lot of our most basic inclinations and the way that we process information, process the world, are based on areas of the brain that are older, things like the brainstem and the amygdala and the limbic system, which regulates our emotions, and our emotions regulate how we act out in the world. All these things are more or less automatically determined, and they're determined without us being in control of it. On the other hand, there's an area of the brain called the neocortex. It's part of the neocortex, and part of the neocortex, that really front part, is called the prefrontal cortex. And from evidence, a lot of the information processing that concerns language and reasoning and planning things out seem to be housed here. So they seem to be housed in the prefrontal cortex. And and so what we have emerging here is that there are these conflicting modules. There are functions in the human mind that are both spatially distributed in terms of the different parts of the brain, and that seem to account for this chasm that was so apparent in Kant between determination and freedom. And so it seems that freedom is really housed more or less in these newer parts of the brain, and the newer parts of the brain that we share with mammals. So a lot of this complexity, information processing complexity, we share mammals, and then I came to a variable that where we exceed mammalian competencies, and this happened to be language. And that with language we can encode information about the world that the sensory inputs are limited. The sensory inputs are circumscribed, right? We can see things, etc., etc. Maybe we can imagine things beyond what we can see. By extension of what we see, we can extrapolate sort of by imagistic processing. But linguistic encoding, this is really an innovation, a social infrastructure that allows us to encode information about the world at a level of granularity that is extremely complex. So inductive generalizations, laws of nature have to be encoded in language. Without language, you couldn't extract these sort of like patterns that are then encoded as statements or as mathematical formalisms. So language really enables this proliferation of how we can represent the world. The representation complexifies, and what this in turn does, it complexifies the human's relationship to their future. So once you can represent a more complex view of the world, right, you can imagine that the world is, well, you have a picture of the world as if we're in a planet, and we have information about it as being part of the solar system, part of a galaxy. So all this information is not really, I have no direct evidence of it. I mean, I have evidence of like lights in the sky, but to really know that there's stars, I have to augment that. That sensory input with more theoretical information. So it wouldn't be possible to know that the lights in the sky are actually other planets or other stars if I don't have all this other theoretical information. And all this other theoretical information really coheres, doesn't contradict itself, and also doesn't contradict internally, right? There's no logical contradictions, but also it seems to agree with most of subsequent experience. Either way, most of our knowledge of the world is augmented through these propositions and through beliefs, and all beliefs are linguistically encoded. They're linguistically encoded, and they're hosted in the mind. And so essentially, that's the house of reason. And what distinguishes reason from other forms of information processing is that it's domain general. Our heuristic systems, the way we perceive things, convex, concave, all these other things, well, they're automatic, and they're part of the heuristic system. So here I'm drawing from Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, is a really popular book back in 2011 and 2010. But it's not just this theory. There's in cognitive science and philosophy and in neuroscience, this is a fairly well-supported claim. The claim that there are very loosely two systems. So the second system is where serial processing can happen. Serial processing takes place through, philosophy takes place through arguments. It takes place through explicit premises and us being able to deduce conclusions. It takes place through inductive generalizations, inductive arguments. All of arguments allow us to work through problems at a very sort of specific and formal sense. This is something that would be not possible in lieu of language, without language. And so language creates a condition of possibility for human freedom. And so we're seeing that some of the claims that Kant is making, well, they're not unfounded, they're not spurious. Even if we reject the Kantian metaphysics and the Kantian sort of picture, the distinction between noumenon and phenomena and his epistemology, we can still sort of rehabilitate his claims in a more current context, and more in a context that agrees with a lot of the scientific evidence about how the human mind works, and how the human brain works, how the human brain is structured, and then how the human mind is really a product of the brain, etc. Okay, so, and then what I did is I showed two clips, a clip of Stephen Pinkett, and another clip of philosopher Daniel Dennett talking about free will. And it's not that they disagree. So with Stephen Pinkett, he says essentially what I'm saying is that the human mind has a complex representation of the world in their head, and this complex representation allows us to plan way further ahead in the future than other species. And so we can imagine, we can entertain, deliberate possibilities in the mind, in virtue of language, in virtue of encoding all kinds of representations about the outer world, and then we manipulate these internal representations internally in such a way as to plan ahead and choose between alternatives. So he essentially is saying is that there's an illusion of choice, but this it is causally determined. It's not like Kant says it's not uncaused. It is causally determined. It's causally determined by neural refineries in the brain, by electrochemical signals going on in the brain. It is caused by that. But the difference is that what we call freedom of will is really explained by this second system. That's Pinker's point. And then we have Dennett's point, which is that, freedom is something that has evolved. Has evolved because the process of evolution by natural selection, it really expands the possibilities of the possibilities of fit between a species and its environment. And so the competencies that mammals have evolved are more complex and have a more complex degree of fit between their cognitive competencies and the world. Well, he says that humans are several degrees removed from that because we have these other competences like language and beliefs, what was called the intentional stance. Intentionality is a term of art in philosophy that refers to mental contents that have an aboutness about them, and this aboutness has a propositional content. Propositional content is just a fancy word for having some sort of subject-predicate structure, right? It has a kind of a linguistic encoding, to put it in a nutshell. And so what Ned is saying, we can represent reasons to ourselves why we do things, and so that in fact factors into why we do things. So the reasons that we tell ourselves why we do things causally influence our actions. Now, and this is where the sort of debate really crystallizes, is in this disjunction, in this conflict between what appears to be the second system and what appear to be a physicalistic framing of human behavior. So on the one hand, you have Sam Harris, who says that really it appears as though you give reasons for your actions, but those reasons are really epiphenomenal. Epiphenomenal meaning that they're not causally efficacious. They're sort of illusory. The reasons are how you rationalize your behavior, but really what causes your behavior is something else. And that something else is, there's a mountain of evidence that our actions are, caused by, first of all, prior events in the brain. They're caused by neural firings. They're caused by a whole architecture, right? And we're not in control of our actions most of the time, right? There's always prior causes, and these causes are really in the brain. This is more or less Sam's point, and so what happens to the reasons that we give for actions? They're essentially epiphenomenal. They're maybe byproducts. We tell ourselves a story, but that's not really the story. The reasons are not causally efficacious. On the other hand, it seems that Dennett is disagreeing with this picture. What he's saying is that the reasons are causally efficacious. So what is going on here? Which of them is right? Well, in some respect, both of them are right. I would say that 90% or more than 90% of our actions are predetermined by these these structures, by these inclinations, by what Kant would call the heteronomy of the will. But then there is a subset of actions where the reasons that we give do factor causally in the outcome. For example, I gave the example of Mahatma Gandhi fasting, sort of to repudiate the British colonial rule in India. So actions like that, where we use reasons to override really basic drives, seems to hammer point that kind of chasm that Kant was talking about. That reason can sort of override that the prefrontal cortex processing can override more basic drives of the limbic system or of the and so this ability to override our more would be inexplicable. It would be for example, to take this example, Gandhi's actions would be inexplicable without recourse to the reasons that he gives for his actions. So it would seem like the reasons that we give are not causally efficacious. They are causally efficacious, even though our mind is essentially causally determined by neural firing in the brain. The neural firing allows for the inner representation of conditions, and we then represent these conditions, and we work things out through language and through premises in there. And those inner thoughts then influence a subset of behaviors. So it's not the case that all of our behaviors we're in control of all of our behaviors. We're not in control of most of them, but we might be in control of a very small subset. Or even if we're not in control, at least our mental deliberations, our mental contents are factoring causally in what ends up happening in the future. And that is more or less closer to my view. And this is the issue of mental causation. It's debated vigorously in philosophy today, and there's all kinds of knots and problems that we won't get into, things like downward causation, whether downward causation is intelligible at all or upward causation makes any sense either. But what we're trying to say is that my essential contention is that our mental contents, as they're hosted by the neural infrastructure, do causally factor into our actions, right? Belief systems influence people's actions. So our beliefs are causally efficacious. Dennett has a more, for example, complex view of this in the sense that he does see beliefs as shorthand for some sort of more complex identity relation, or rather identity of some neural pattern, however complex that pattern is. And I'm not here denying the identity relation, but the idea that beliefs are merely shorthand, their beliefs are heuristics for what's really going on, that's a little bit beyond this discussion. Beliefs are partially heuristical, I would say, but not entirely. And the representation then affects the reality. So there is a subset of behaviors where the way we represent the world affects the way then that we act in the world and the possibilities that we see within it. Okay, so this doesn't really solve the problem of free will, but it's inching toward where the points of contention really lie. And so in the next discussion, what I'll be talking about is the two kind of prongs of the issue, which are incompatibilism and compatibilism. So incompatibilism, free will, and determinism are incompatible. If the free will premise or thesis is true, then determinism has to be false. And then compatibilism, on the other hand, says that both freedom of the will and determinism are compatible. To really flesh this out, what we have to do is determine whether you could have acted otherwise, right? So we define determinism as the conjunction of the laws of nature, and all of the events until some arbitrary point in time entail one and one possible future. Well, what we have to show is that that picture of determinism is actually not true. that picture of determinism might be false. And this is how this works out. So remember, I believe it's Dennett who has this thought experiment where he says, let's say you roll back the clock, right? Let's say you have the evolution of the universe in time, right? The totality of the universe, right? And let's imagine that it's unfolding in this sort of deterministic, apodictic manner. Bracket any thoughts that you have about quantum mechanics and whether quantum mechanics foils this thought experiment or not. And so it's unfolding inexorably, and then you roll back the clock, right? And then you play it again. The question is, would it play out in the exact same way, or would certain outcomes be different? It would seem like quantum mechanically it wouldn't play out exactly the same way, but it would play very, very closely to how it played out before. There are others that think that this is not exactly relevant to free will, but the essential contention is whether when you have this experience of deliberating alternatives in the head and you're giving reasons for making one decision over another, and you what's the word? You do cost-benefit analysis of what the better action, what the course of action to do is, whether that deliberation is what's causing the choice, one, and two, whether it was possible for you to choose the alternative. And it would seem like, when you think about it rationally, that yes, this would be the case, that once you're deliberating, that both alternatives are available to you. Well, and then the question is whether determinism precludes this possibility. So those who are incompatibilists say, well, it precludes this possibility. Determinism entails one and one possible future at every step of the way, and compatibilists say, well, no, my ability to do otherwise and laws of nature are not in conflict. Plurality of futures are available to me, consistent with the past. And so what we'll do next, in the next discussion, I will get into Peter van Inwagen's the mind argument. We'll get into Robert Kane's model of free will, where he invokes quantum mechanics in his model of free will. This has largely been, well, I wouldn't say discredited, but it's not really taken too seriously. And we'll talk more about mental causation and what some of the problems of mental causation are. We'll also talk about Libet's experiments in 1983 and why, well, these were purportedly showing that before we make a choice, it's predetermined by several milliseconds by neural firings in the brain. And what we'll show is that Libet's experiments do not really prove that do not really prove the unfreedom of the will. That what they show is far more minimal. And we'll basically end by saying, well, the evidence is essentially inconclusive, and what the implications for moral culpability essentially are. We will also talk about complex systems, levels of description, levels of representation. The brain is a complex system, possibilities for weak and strong emergence, and why the puzzle remains with us to this day. Why the freedom of will is such a profound intellectual conundrum, such that to resolve it brings to bear, or it would seem to bring to bear, all kinds of domains of knowledge, from the fundamental constitution of reality, right, the formulation of determinism or indeterminism, to the best theories that we have about cognition, right? It brings all these to bear to try to solve this problem. And the fact that there is disagreement amongst the brightest minds, people who are, state of the art in these areas of knowledge, disagree, and that the distribution of the disagreement is does not strongly tip to one view over another shows that we don't really know, and this intellectual conundrum remains with us. And some of the ways we have considered framings of the problems we've considered, from Boethius to Kant to Daniel Dennett and Steven Pinker, these are there are continuous threads, even though there are many discontinuities there, and it's a fascinating intellectual problem that is worth pondering every once in a while, even though most of the time we just sort of don't think about it. Thanks.